All right, greetings, everyone, and welcome to the October 1st, 2024 meeting of the Mecklenburg County Economic Development Committee. I'm Commissioner Susan Rodriguez McDowell, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair of this committee. So let's see. Are we going to do the introduction? Is there anybody on the remote? Do we have to go through the whole spiel? Okay. So first we'll start with introductions, and we will introduce everyone in the room and then the no one that's online. Okay, so
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Meyer, and I represent District 5.
Good afternoon, Lee Altman, County Commissioner, serving at large.
all right, fantastic. And let's go with Deputy County Manager. Awesome. Deputy County.
Good afternoon, Deputy County Manager Leslie Johnson.
Hi, I'm County Economist Michael Simmons.
I'm Chuck McShane, Director of Market Analytics for CoStar.
Do you want to go this way? Great.
Tom DeLong, City of Charlotte Economic Development.
Shahid Rana, Deputy Director.
Clay Andrews, Senior Program Manager for the Office of Economic Development.
Janelle Rosales, Economic Development.
Keisha Whitley, Economic Development.
Jamelia Davis, Economic Development.
Agustin Velasquez, Economic Development.
Jackson Irfani, UNC Chapel Hill Fellow, Economic Development.
Aviance McKenzie, Program Officer, Office of Economic Development.
Jamari Timmons, Compliance Officer, Office of Economic Development.
And online, we have Ellie Fester from Economic Development and Britt Clampett.
Awesome. All right, fantastic. So, sorry, was there? Oh, and Megan. Okay. All right. So let's begin with our approval of our meeting minutes from September 17th. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right. That is unanimous. And the meeting minutes for September 17th have been approved. I think I just wanted to acknowledge that Commissioner Jarrell is, and our vice chair is away. And we do have a quorum without him, but we do miss his presence being here today. So now are we going into closed session first? Okay, because that's what my script says, but I'm going to recognize you.
No.
Okay. All right. Oh, okay. I skipped over a little part. So, but we do have closed session after.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Excellent. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Deputy County Manager Leslie Johnson.
Sure, no doubt, no problem. Being mindful of time, we have two heavy lifts of agenda items today. The first one, Chuck has already introduced himself, but Chuck McShane is with CoStar, and Chuck will be providing us an overview of the state of the office market here in Charlotte and giving us an independent kind of view of what's going on in the marketplace and helping us understand the trend lines there. The second presentation will be by Shahid Rana, and he will be providing the macro level overview of economic modeling tools to include the county's perspective and utilization of REMI, but he'll start as an overview of the introductory kind of understanding of the tools, the different types of tools that are in the marketplace, and then a little bit more about REMI and why we use REMI as our marketing tool. With that, I'll go ahead and let Chuck introduce himself a little further, as well as give you the high-level overview of the state of the Charlotte office market.
May I interrupt, Madam Chair?
Sure.
Thank you so much. I always like to know what the presentation is queuing us up for, because I need to know, like, it helps me to know what to listen for. So, like, is there another ask for office markets coming, or are we thinking about getting whatever the REMI model? Like, just so I kind of know what the behind the back end is.
Sure. As you may recall,
Yes.
maybe you don't recall, Commissioner Altman has asked for a special request of information to better understand. We have had in the past a couple of requests as relates to the uptown office market and being partners as relates to that. And then there have been some consultants that have shared as part of their presentation the lens as relates to the office space environment in uptown. And so what we wanted to do is step back and have an independent, so you're not hearing from developers or consultants who are trying to drive decisions as relates to uptown solely, but to have a holistic understanding with regards to what's happening in our marketplace for office space, because there may be some other request in the future, but this isn't being preempted because of requests. This is being as a follow-up to your inquiry to try to have an understanding from the independent view of what's happening in our marketplace. So that's what that is. Brandon, of course, is here as well. He's recently given us information as a quarterly update as executive leadership of just about various economic trends. And so he's also available to answer any additional questions that you may not hear from Chuck. So that's that one. Similarly, there was a request to understand about the REMI tool. And just kind of what I recognized is when the county embarked on us having that particular economic modeling tool, it was many years ago. And the board, at least the board as well as the Economic Development Committee has changed. So that premier kind of introductory and making sure everyone was understand the basis of why we chose that tool, those individuals that were on the Board of County Commissioners is no longer here, or only a subset, or they're definitely not part of this committee. So that is the intent of just more foundational information to make sure that this committee has an awareness about those two things.
Thank you. And is the overview of the market going to just be uptown market or the
No, ma'am.
across the county?
No, it'll be across the county.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, ma'am.
All right.
Okay, great. Well, I'll get started then. Just have a few takeaways I want to kick off with in terms of the office market. Let's see if we can get to the next slide here. You can go to the next. Up, okay. Sounds like the office market. Yeah, if you can just go to the next slide, that'd be great. So just to kind of encapsulate the market, if there's nothing else to take away from the slides I'm going to show, I would say these four elements are really the key takeaways for the office market right now in Charlotte. The biggest trend, and this is nothing new, we've been hearing about this over the last 4 years, is office tenants are signing smaller leases and they're going into the newest buildings. So the big challenge is the backfill of older space, both in Uptown and throughout the market. This is a national trend. We're starting to get to a little clearer position now with the office market. We now have in Charlotte, 60% of the leases that were signed prior to the pandemic have expired and rolled off. So most of the space that's occupied now was based on a lease signed after the pandemic. So with the new paradigm in mind. The other side of things we're seeing now is that office construction has really declined, has come down to decade level lows. This is a trend we saw. I would compare it mostly to retail, and I can get into that a little bit later. I would compare it to retail 15 years ago after the last recession when speculative construction really declined. And there was a lot of pain after the recession in the retail market, but we've now emerged with a record low vacancy rate in the retail market, but it took quite a while to get there. I think office may be following a similar path with a lot of pain between now and the future of the office market. That could stabilize vacancies by 2026, but they're not going to come down very, very quickly. We are starting to see some sales happen with the office market, and that's beginning to reveal how steep the decline in values is going to be. We've seen some between 30 and 60% behind their 2019 values of recent deals that have closed in 2024. You go to the next slide. And just to step back to 2019, kind of how we got here since this pandemic period. Charlotte has not seen, if you look just at the demand side, it has not seen that steep a decline in demand compared to other markets. We've had about 1.4 million square feet of negative absorption. So we have about 1.4 million square feet less office space occupied today than in 2019. And that's roughly the top 7 among the top 10 markets in terms of stability of office demand. Not positive like Austin or Miami, but certainly not negative like San Francisco, New York, or some other markets. Well above, represents about 1% of inventory, well above the national average of around 2.5% of decline. However, if you go to the next slide, we have seen the fifth biggest increase in office vacancies in the country among large markets. So there's a couple different reasons for this, and really it's more of a supply story in Charlotte than it is a demand story. It's similar to in Nashville and Austin, where we've also seen big increases in the vacancy rate. On the flip side, New York has seen a big increase in the vacancy rate, and demand was the challenge there. San Francisco got hit on both sides with demand collapsing just as they had a lot of supply coming online as well. So if you go to the next slide, that puts that into context, the supply-demand balance. So if you look at the 3 years before the pandemic, the 4 years before the pandemic, 2016 through 2019, you see demand was, net absorption was about 9.7 million square feet. So we added 9.7 million square feet of occupied space. At the same time, we added 9 million square feet of new construction. So it was a market relatively in balance, actually a little more demand than supply, and vacancies were quite low at 7%. And that led a lot of developers to break ground on new space, anticipating that this demand would continue, as it probably would have if we had not had the disruption of COVID. So we had 9.3 million square feet of new space deliver since 2020. A lot of those broke ground in 2018, 2019, and delivered into this new environment as we saw demand collapse, 1.4 million square feet of negative demand over this time period. And that led to this doubling of vacancies.
Thank you. I just want a quick interjection. For scale purposes, this building is 400,000 square feet of office. So when he says 1 million square feet, 1.5, the government's in is 400,000 square feet of office. So as you're going through the presentation, you're trying to get a comparison, 3x the size of this building when he says 1.2 or, so I just wanted to take a quick pause there for clarification.
So thank you. So basically there's the equivalent of 1.5 government, this government building that's unoccupied.
When he's referencing the 1.
That doesn't seem like a whole lot.
That's the decline of
That's
space,
the decline.
the decline of occupied space over the last.
So there's that much fewer occupied now than there were before the pandemic.
Which means there was still a vacancy before, but there's even more vacancy. So as he continues to tell the story, I just wanted to pause right there, but he's going to share more in the presentation.
There's roughly in the metro area, there's roughly 19 million square feet of unoccupied office space. Correct. If you go to the next slide. And one of the things we're seeing too is our numbers are actually, our vacancy rate numbers that we quote are a bit lower than some of the brokerages because we include medical office in there, which has been relatively stable. In fact, vacancy rates have declined there by about 5% over the last 4 years. It's not something you can't do medical office remote. So those spaces have remained in demand, while overall the traded traditional leased office vacancies are approaching 20%. If you go to the next slide. And there's been clear winners and losers here over the last 4 years. The newer office spaces have leased up very well. If you see the blue bars here, that's space of positive absorption. So there were more move-ins than move-outs in these buildings by those that many millions of square feet. The red bars show negative absorption in buildings built before 2015. So they had more move-outs than move-ins. Consistently since 2020 every year. So we've seen a lot of in-market moves from older buildings to newer buildings. And typically that's meant a decline in the amount of space. Not always, but in general, it's been moving from an old building to a new building and taking less space. And if you go to the next slide, it'll show you a little bit more how that's shaping out in terms of average lease size. You can see that the average lease size, well, it ticked up a little bit in 2024. We had a few big renewals that stabilized that. Overall, lease size is about 20% on average lower than it was prior to the pandemic. So about 5,200 square feet on average per lease, per office lease, down to roughly around 4,000 currently. If you go to the next slide, putting all that together, it just really is going to mean we're going to have more leases to fill the same amount of space going forward. So the blue bar here shows the decline in the number of leases compared to that pre-pandemic average 2015 through 2019. We've seen about 6% fewer leases, but because they've been 20% smaller, we've had 22% less leasing volume in the market. So new leases, office users are leasing less space per each office user. They're also, and that's leading to a 22% decline in future demand in the leasing volume that we've seen this year so far going forward. So fewer leases leading to a larger decline in total leasing volume. And if you look at where we've seen the change in the effect on older buildings throughout the market, it's been really acute in Uptown. The Uptown market actually has a relatively low vacancy rate in newer buildings. A lot of that has been stabilized by owner-occupied offices. So Ally Bank, for example, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, they all own some of their own office space Uptown. But what they've done is they've moved from older lease space into their new space, and that's left pre-2000 buildings Uptown about 29% vacant. So, and there's a few more move-outs to come there. But it's not just confined to Uptown. We've seen that also, especially in airport and university, some pretty high vacancy rates in pre-2000 buildings there. Ballantyne actually has a higher vacancy rate for 2000 and after buildings. However, that's really confined to a subset of campus buildings that were built around 2001 to 2004, so early 2000s, relatively older buildings. But the vacancy rate is elevated there as well. South Park's been fairly stable, has a lot of old supply in that area, but has pretty consistent demand. And then South End has gotten the most buzz in terms of the most stable office market. Has a little bit of elevated vacancy on new properties because it has that one spec building there that's still leasing up, that just delivered, and they're trying to find a tenant for. So that's why you have that higher vacancy rate on newer space there.
Chuck, isn't this what's kind of called in real estate the flight to quality?
It's the flight, yes.
Because when the market gets soft, the guys at the top can make deals to attract people to their new space. That makes the space lower down even less attractive, no matter what rate it is. And so there's kind of this flight to quality that the bigger buildings the newer buildings don't have any trouble making deals. They may not be the type of deals they'd rather make, but they can fill the space up. Whereas the ones that are not as attractive have fewer options.
And oftentimes a tenant who is taking less space will be willing to pay a higher per square foot space in a higher quality building rather than stay in that older, large space in an older building. Another headwind we're seeing for the office market going forward is the growth in office using employment. We've started to see that over the last year flatline. So, and this is Charlotte and nationwide. It's a nationwide trend, but we're also seeing it in Charlotte. So if you look at the typical industries that use the office, finance, information technology, professional services, growth in those sectors is below the trend that we would have expected heading into the pandemic. And it hasn't grown a whole lot over the last year. So we've seen relatively flat growth in office using employment. And that's another hit to demand for office space going forward. If you go to the next slide. Another trend.
Can we go back?
Yeah.
Thank you. So how's this category different than what we've been talking about?
These are jobs. These are office using jobs. So job growth in terms of hiring for positions in the financial services sector and the professional services sector. So these are the people who would
work at a factory. These are jobs that would take place in an office.
Office using. Okay.
So these are the people. I was talking about the space earlier. These are the people that would fill the space, and we're not adding many jobs in this category over the last year. We're behind trend on that growth.
And is that because of remote work?
It has been certainly because of hybrid work and remote work, but also more recently we've seen the higher interest rate environment has led to less hiring in financial services, professional services nationwide. We've seen less growth in these sectors. And getting back to the space side of things, one of the things we've seen from the larger employers in Charlotte, especially, this is something we're seeing nationwide, but it's very relevant to Charlotte in particular because we do have a lot of large employers that the banks in particular, Duke Energy and others that own their own space and have moved people into space that they own rather than leasing space. And so we've actually seen increase in owner occupied space, decrease in occupancy in leased buildings. I think this is an opportunity as well. You saw Vanguard's purchase of Centene as an example of this is going to be an owner use space. And you're also seeing some owners get active in the buying market because they think now is a time to potentially buy buildings at a good deal that they can then move their employees into rather than leasing space. If you go to the next slide. So this gets into the, I think some of the positives for the office market going forward. I alluded to this in the first slide. 63% of leases that were signed prior to April 2020 have expired now. So they've rolled off. And we only have, 37% of these leases yet to expire. A good chunk of them are going to be expiring in the next couple of years. So we have this space is rolling off. It's not going to be as, and a lot of the space is already on the sublet market. So we're going to see, we've seen the initial shock to the system in terms of new space coming on the market. Vacancy rates aren't increasing as rapidly as they were, but because the leases that have been signed were based on decisions made in the new post-pandemic era. If you go to the next slide. And the other positive for construction or for office use is that construction has started to decline considerably. So we've seen construction starts go back to 2014 levels, and we haven't seen a whole lot break ground since 2023, and that includes the Pearl there. So that's going to mean less new space, new competition for brand new space, and you're going to start to see tenants consider the second best option, the older spaces that are in better shape, that have more capital investment, that are in good locations. And this is what we saw in retail in a very slow progression from the last recession. So we'll start to see some of those buildings that have the most capital investment, the most owners that have the most financial wherewithal to withstand challenges going forward. Some of those buildings will be in good shape, but others will be obsolete. And if you go to the next slide, putting that all together, we'll see less new deliveries coming online in 24, 25, and beyond. And so with that, we think that vacancy rates will probably peak around 16% in 2025. But we don't see any evidence that the vacancy rate will come down very quickly unless you have removal of that supply, some demolitions potentially. But we don't see vacancy rates coming back down to pre-pandemic levels soon, but we don't see them rising much more after all these pandemic era leases have begun to roll off, and not a whole lot of new construction is there to compete for new tenants. On the value side, we've also seen values on closed properties, sold properties decline back to 2015 levels. The 425 there is a bit misleading because we did see some really high-end trophy properties sell during this period, brand new South End properties that lifted that per square foot price to 425 in 2021. You also had really, really low interest rates. But now that we're settling into this new environment, we've seen the properties that are selling are selling at a very low per square foot price comparable to 10 years ago. And just to give you a few examples of that on the next slide, if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the deals that have closed recently, about 45% down. The Johnston building that's going to become a hotel sold for 45% less than in 2019. Centene, the tax assessment isn't maybe is the only comp that we had available, but it was about 30% lower than its tax assessment. And if you go to the next, slide. Airport's suburban property and airport submarket sold for 57% less than its 2016 price. And then even as far back as 2023, July, a property in South Park sold for about 27% less than its February 2016 price. And I think the plan there is for a mixed use redevelopment on that site to include apartments and some office. So just to wrap up, I think this really supports all of these elements that we've talked about. Tenants are signing smaller leases in newer buildings. We're at a little clearer point for what we can expect in the office market going forward. And one of those things we can expect is less construction, which is going to mean less competition from newer buildings. But we still have that large inventory of older buildings. And there'll be some winners and losers in that segment, but that has to shake out. And we'll have to see some more deals close before we really understand how much these values are changing, but they're certainly down from pre-pandemic levels.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Let's see if we have any questions from my colleagues.
Thank you for the presentation. And really, my only question is, are you seeing more construction, say, out in University or Ballantyne, places that people want to work where they live versus, I mean, is there a comparison there?
I would say that the office vacancies have been challenged both uptown and in some of these suburban submarkets. Some of the older suburban spaces as challenged as some of the uptown space. But we have seen in recent years a little more uptake of that older space in the suburban areas that are closer to where people live. And I've seen anecdotally more in-office attendance in some of those South Charlotte properties from some of the larger employers.
That's all.
Okay, thank you. What did you say the square footage of the government building is again?
400,000.
400,000. And I think I heard y'all say that there is 19 million square feet of unoccupied office space in Charlotte right now.
Correct.
Okay, just want to make sure I had those numbers straight. You know, the slowdown not seen since 2014 in office construction, does that sort of foretell bigger problems for our local economy? And similarly, to see office prices per square foot, $147 per square foot is what it is today. The last time the comparable value was 2015. And then thirdly, to see some of these major assets selling for 20 to 50% less than what they sold for, you know, their previous sale value. Like that seems like some fairly serious economic, indicators for this community. So how do you assess what it's saying about the bigger picture, the economy here in Mecklenburg County?
I would say I would separate the office market from the economy to some extent. I would say the office construction is more of a response to the office economy, to the demand for office space versus the broader economy. I do think there are some challenges to office hiring. I don't think they're dire at this point, but I would say the decline in office construction is more a response to the decline in office demand, which, while related to economic growth, is not as connected as it once was because of the influence of remote work, because offices are taking less space than they used to be.
Okay.
Yeah,
We've got the economist here.
I think
Please.
you might have some data on this too, though, but a lot of the new construction is greatly needed because there's not a lot of big open spaces in what's available in a lot of the Class A right now to house large tenants. And that's what you're seeing as well. So, there's going to be demand whenever these new spaces do deliver. And I don't know, what about subleasing space and stuff? That's been, a trend as well as companies are downsizing for their remote workers and kind of shifting around. And I think that'll get us through a lot of this as until their leases expire and they can really right-size their holdings.
Okay, but can you talk a little bit more about and I appreciate the distinction that you're making. This is telling us about the economy of this particular submarket. But can you, sir, comment on, and maybe that's something for another presentation, but since this seems like a pretty serious red flag, I'm just kind of curious about the other leading indicators that you look to. What are they and how are they doing?
So I would say, let us come back and make that presentation because they are, as Chuck was trying to allude to, this is office space. So then you got the retail space and we're seeing inclines and upticks there. You've got the residential. So you've got the combination. And I think you need to understand the whole. This one was solely about office space and what's happening in the office space. But I think there are very important things to be mindful of in the space of office space. One, as he already referenced, people who are choosing to lease office space are getting less square footage, probably because of remote work. They do not need to have as many people in offices, and so they're not leasing these big buildings. People are choosing the new ones over the old ones. So we better have to understand what's in our housing, what's in our office stock of old buildings, and what is it going to take for that to be an attractive space. And what you have started to hear, even in one sprinkle of a presentation at one point in time, some of those old buildings are being contemplated to no longer be office spaces or no longer 100% office spaces, but to be repurposed for some other utilization because they can't sell them as office spaces or they have to be renovated in order to do that. So back to your question, so I won't kind of detour too long, as I definitely think that we have an opportunity to help you understand, like we normally do for the board as a whole, the economy as a whole, and make that presentation so you can see the interdependencies and yet the unique separation as it relates to what's happening in our economy.
And lastly, you said, what's going on and what's going to be needed to make those properties more attractive. And I guess I continue to have reservations about what government's role is in that, because these are all privately held. This is someone's has the wherewithal to make these investments and reap the benefits. And so obviously, while I want to do what I need to protect the well-being of the public, I'm not, and I do want to understand this. I'm glad for the presentation. I asked for it. I also continue to have reservations about the question of whether it's for us to ask what to make it more attractive.
Correct. And I'm not saying in this presentation, we're not leaning one way or the other. We're just sharing with you the information and letting you know that the owners of those properties are having to contemplate differently of what they're going to do with their ownership of their property.
Okay.
And it's no different than someone's home. And there's a period of time that newer homes are more attractive than older homes.
Mhm.
It's the same philosophy of what's happening in this space of the market. And just like we don't necessarily put in some incentives or something for my personal house to make it be more attractive to someone so that if I want to choose it to sell it, it's the same thing for office. You as a board, starting at the committee, we eventually will have conversations with you to try to understand, is this a no space for you, or you're willing under what type of circumstances? Because what you've heard to date has been focused around Uptown, and what we're trying to share with you in this holistic view is the trends that we're seeing are beyond Uptown. So when you start contemplating, is public sector in or out? What are the types of things that we need to factor in if we are leaning in? Have that holistic view. You're welcome.
Wait, is that okay? So I wanted to understand the bar graph that you have that shows Uptown, Airport, University, Ballantyne. So yeah, so it used to be, I think, that Uptown would have had the highest rents. Is that still the case, or is it really shifting?
It's shifted. They certainly have higher rents than, say, than Airport or University, but South End is now the highest rent market.
Right. Okay. And so I'm trying to understand if it's far behind or if it's comparable, like, how do you compare
I mean, I think the newest properties are a little more comparable,
to each
South
other?
End to Uptown.
Okay.
Uptown has a large inventory of older properties that are seeing much lower rent
Mhm.
prices or asking rents versus, so just to give you comparisons, I would say that the newest properties tend to be asking around $50 a square foot. In South End, maybe a couple dollars less in Uptown, whereas some of the older properties in Uptown are between high, as low as the high 20s to the high 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of
Right,
the
right.
numbers I have on it this is from second quarter. If you look at Uptown, they're around $37. South End, Midtown's around $46 a square foot. And then, as you get into the more suburban markets, you're around $31 and average
Right.
for those.
Okay. So tell me if this seems right. Like, so the newer spaces, maybe would you say they're more considered luxury? Like they have more amenities, they have more, why do people want the newer ones as opposed to the older ones? It's because there's a cool factor of where they're located, or the actual building itself. Is it more considered higher end?
I mean, I think they're a little bit of all of that. I think it's the location. I think it's the technology. I think it's the space is outfitted to the most for the most updated technology. It has good collaborative space. Maybe it has some outdoor space. It's just more modern than the older space in general.
So I guess I'm sort of trying in my mind to compare this to like NOAA's for residential, like naturally occurring affordable housing. So are the older buildings naturally occurring affordable office space?
Not until they would sell at a lower basis and then be reconverted. And I don't know that you would see rents fall at that much in Uptown versus unless they were sold at a lower price and an owner could buy it at a lower basis that could then accept those lower rents.
I have a little bit of data on this as well. When we're talking about these different spaces, they're normally divided into what they call Class A space, Class B. Class A is looks like many of the updated facilities in this building. Yes, nice facades, things like that. A lot of that's done to attract the tenant to come to the space. Now, in the county, there's roughly 42 million square foot of Class A space and around 15 million of Class B. The rent difference between those is around $36 for Class A and you're around $27, $28 for on average for your Class B. So there has been moves of these owners and such to update. They're gonna capture more rent that way. They're gonna and attract tenants more easily. So that's.
Yeah, there is some filtering definitely that happens where you have older space with rents coming down or not rising really as much as the newer space and capturing a different tenant base. There's a floor to that though, where it's not worth it at any price. I think you'll see some buildings reach that at some point.
Okay. I think this is a fascinating, conversation on one level, because I think about how, even just architecture, makes a difference in where people desire to work. And if like you mentioned, if we look at older areas where it's not fashionable anymore, but then it does tend to come back into fashion at some point and gets renovated, but only if it's quality architecture to start with. If it's just, rectangle boxes that are going up that, like it just matters so much what we're building. And so I think I'm trying to look for the parallels between why do we have such a shortage of housing. That's a big problem, right? Nationally and locally. And then we have all this space for offices. And it seems like builders who are building in the housing area are building more luxury because they can get more profit that way. Whereas they're not building in that sort of middle and lower end because they can't make as much money, right? And so I'm trying to figure out how, and I know I'm not talking about trying to convert offices to housing. I'm just trying to look at how it compares the model, of the space and how it's being utilized. So anyway, thank
Something
you.
I'll share with you for consideration when you think about offices, and I'll go to the South End model. South End has a lot of conveniences. So it's not just the building and where it's located, but it is also what supports that part of that geography. So you may have certain types of restaurants. You may be able to have convenient access, meaning walking trails or light rail. You may have, so you have a whole lot of things that make that package of why that site location is attractive.
Right.
A light rail, that's just the light rail. It could be the walking trails. It could be the look of green space, a host of different things that could be part of the comprehensive package for the building. You can take that same building, like you can take that same house and you can build it somewhere else.
Right.
But if it doesn't have the other supporting things, if it doesn't have the unique restaurants, if it doesn't have XYZ, what are those things that are attractive for leaseholders in that commercial space? It doesn't matter. And that what you see, that the reason how you see it is land and land prices or square footage in the submarkets, and many of the submarkets are cheaper, right? It's more affordable, it's a lower cost, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's those locations the developers are going to choose, because they may have a harder time still marketing that product. So in those instances, sometimes they'll go ahead and still pick the higher end product because they feel like they can get their greater return on investment. So some of it really is the combination of things, that comprehensive view of what happens in that geography.
Right. Which is why it's so important, the Center City Partners and them trying to activate.
Correct. And do
uptown.
other types of things.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for this presentation and the discussion. And, I think we will be revisiting and it's just great to sort of make this as one of our building blocks as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, the second agenda item that we have for you in open session is on our economic impact modeling tools that we use. And so I will transfer the presentation now to Shaw.
All right, and before we transition, thank you, Chuck, for presentation and time. Keisha, if you can grab I don't know if that clicker may work here, if it's closer. We'll see. If not, Janelle's going to be on next slide detail. It was working? All right, cool. Well, good afternoon. I'm going to try to make this as interesting, and I won't kind of do too much data back to back on you, but I wanted to talk about economic models overview. And before I jump in, as a part of the Economic Development Committee, you're oftentimes seeing projects come in firsthand before the commission, and we're bringing projects that may have a jobs component or some type of new taxable investment, and we're always talking about what's the overall impact on the community. And back in December, Brandon came in to give a presentation on the REMI model, which was very specific to the REMI model and its capabilities. But there were also discussions about, are there other tools and how does the REMI model work? And there's a lot of questions about how do we really take into consideration our due diligence as a staff. And we really wanted to take the time to do a one-on-one, not just for the committee here, but for the general public and for everyone to really understand what goes into really evaluating a project. So what are really the benefits of the economic impact study? There's really three main benefits that we wanted to talk about. And it's the quantitative estimation. So you'll often hear about, the change in jobs or the GDP of a community or household incomes. That's a quantitative estimation. So that's the forecast. So oftentimes you may hear from Brandon, the economist, when it comes to a board retreat, and he's talking about the state of the housing economy and where jobs going towards. That's the quantitative estimation. There's also the policy and decision making as well. And this is really to understand the fiscal impacts on the community. So if we were to say, hey, we're going towards universal pre-K, what would that cost? What's the impact on a household? How long will a program such as ARPA have an impact on the community? That's more so the policy decision making. And then last but not least is community and funding support. So as you're looking very similar to the BIPs or TIGs or some of the P3 public-private partnership opportunities that we have that come before you, we often use economic impact studies to really understand, hey, what are some of the impacts on this decision that we have? And I really wanted to take the time to do a little bit of a one-on-one. So when we talk about economic impact models, many of the models would use what we call an input-output. So with input-output, input refers to the resources like fuel or labor that goes into the production of a good or service. And then the output is the finished product or result that results in, just combined resources. So I have a very plain example there, right? So if I like to eat corn chips, right? So if Shaw likes to eat a whole bag of corn chips and I go beyond the serving size, here as my example, right? That's me. If I eat the corn, so
Good choice on the line.
right,
You're not a teacher. This is what I
right. So if the action is I utilize resources to buy the chips, that's the initial action, right? There's a resource being poured into an action. Shaw bought a bag of chips. Now you have direct input, which if I eat the whole bag and I go beyond the serving size, I may weigh more, right? Those are not my feet. I know what you're thinking. Those are not my feet, right? My blood pressure may go higher. These are some of the other impacts from the initial buy and then eating the entire bag or multiple bags. I may have to buy larger clothes. So when we talk about the framework of input output, we're talking about the input of the initial action and then the output, or what are the several reactions that happen from the initial action. So now if I take that same concept and I look at what we call multipliers. So Shaw buys the chips, he eats the chips. There's other impacts. Those impacts are called multipliers. So the outputs are multipliers. So if I were to run this through an example, so let's say this chip company that I love to buy my corn chips from, I bought so many corn chips, they want a BIP. They're ready to expand their facility in Mecklenburg County. They're saying, hey, we have this one user in Mecklenburg. He's spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on corn chips. And because of his demand, we need to create a larger supply of chips. They come to Clay and say, Clay, we need to look at a BIP because we want to expand our facility and we're going to need more workers. We're going to need more workers to make these chips. We're going to need a larger facility. We're going to need new equipment. We want to come to the county to meet up with this demand. So the initial action here is a BIP incentive, which could also be seen as the initial action, the input here. So if a corporation comes to us for a BIP, there's kind of a cause and effect. So the initial effect is they receive a BIP incentive. With that incentive, they use the cash to help them fund the expansion of the facility and to hire more workers. Okay, well, we'll call them manufacturer A, our chip company. They start buying more corn from a supplier. Now that they have the BIP, they've expanded their facilities, they're looking to bring on more new jobs, they have to buy more corn from a supplier. Well, that's a direct multiplier from the BIP incentive. And then from the direct comes indirect. So if they buy more corn from the supplier, guess what? Now the supplier has to buy more corn. So there's a chain reaction that happens from the initial BIP. So if the corn supplier buys more corn, guess what? The farm that they're buying the corn from hires more people. And then the farm, they have more gas, more supplies, more equipment. That's what we call the induced costs. So when we talk about input output and we talk about the total impact, sometimes you'll hear in large projects, hey, this deal has a $50 billion total economic impact. And you're like, wait a minute, how do we figure this out? Where does that number come from? How do we know if it's fluff? Where are you getting these figures from? How do we fact check these things? Well, with multipliers, there's certain data sets that we utilize. So for instance, this red line here is a baseline forecast. So Brandon, the economist, will sit before you every year and say, here's the state of the economy, right? We're looking to spend X amount of dollars. We know how many people are going to buy homes. We know how many people are going to buy cars. And we have a general baseline idea of where we're going to trend towards as an economy. He takes multiple things into consideration. And Brandon just doesn't make those numbers up. Actually, Brandon is actually one of the nation's leaders in economic impact modeling, specifically for REMI. He's also won a NACO award for REMI. And he's actually going to a conference, which is in 2 weeks.
I'll be providing just some data of how we model these things as been requested by a bunch of the other users in various states.
So he's the trainer guy. So I learned from one of the best on a weekly basis. But when we look at forecast baseline data and we talk about the multipliers of how do we know if farmer X is going to buy more corn? How do we know how many people he's going to hire? How do we know how much that gas and that tractor is going to cost? Well, Brandon takes various data sets from trusted sources. The baseline data sources come from the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Congressional Budget Office, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. Department of Labor, North American Industry Classification Systems. So I'm giving you a bunch of trusted government sources where they take survey data every year and sometimes on a quarterly basis. That data is then inputted into an economic development model. So when we have a new investment, so if we're predicting, hey, we want to give a BIP or a TIG, what's the impact on our economy? Then we work with an economic modeling tool that understands A, what's the trend, and B, what does the new investment have on that impact? So the blue line would be my corn chip company. If they're looking to get a BIP and they start producing more corn chips, and I keep going to the store and buying these corn chips, then Brandon can basically have a line predictor to see, okay, what are the other multiplying effects if we give this company a BIP? They have money to expand their facility. They have more money to hire more workers, and essentially by Shaw, I can buy more corn chips, right? So that's kind of where we are. So I'm building a story here. So when we look at this from a Mecklenburg County BIP economic impact model, oftentimes we come before you and you will see this graph here, and there's red lines and there's blue lines and there's yellow lines, and we're all trying to figure out. And I think by the end of the day, we're kind of ready to go. And you probably heard enough from me talking. You got to go to a dinner meeting. You're thinking about the next thing. And we kind of look and see, okay, does that overlap the red? That's what we want to see. We want to make sure that green is over the red. But let me get a slight, just breakdown on what this truly means. The new investment here is, that data is provided and verified by staff. So that data is information from the company. We can verify how much they spend on a brand new facility by the receipts and by the tax records. That's verifiable. That's number one. So that isn't information that's spit out by a computer and we're trying to figure out. We also know what's verified is how many new workers are brought on because of the new investment, right? We check data, we check payroll receipts. Companies also provide North Carolina unemployment insurance data, which is on a quarterly basis. So we know how many people work in each company per quarter, how much they make. And at the end of the year, to receive a BIP, Clay, myself, the team, Keisha, we sit down, we work with that company, and we verify their data so we know how many people were hired, how much they made. So when we come to you, say they're going to make X amount of salary on an average wage, we can verify that. So there's no mystery behind the new taxable investment, the new jobs, and the actual wage that they're making, right? So that's the new jobs. Then we have the multipliers. And oftentimes we'll say this company is going to produce X amount of new jobs. There's going to be X amount of money that's going to be spent in the sales tax revenue. And how do we know that? Well, these new jobs basically are classified by what we call the SOC, the Standard Occupational Code. And oftentimes we'll bring this to you. We'll say, okay, this Standard Occupational Code is a 4132, and these assembly workers, they make an average of $47,000. Well, based off of the data sources that I showed you before, every employer profile has a habit. So the New York stockbroker has a habit of buying certain things and living in certain places. And the team assembly person who works on the production line has certain habits where they can spend their money at certain places and they have a certain budget. That's all verifiable trend data based off of the resources that I shared with you. So we know to a certain degree that if we're going to bring in a factory that's going to make Shaw all of his corn chips, and those workers make a certain amount of dollars, we know to a certain degree on how their paycheck is going to be divided between their home, their spending on their food, what they pay for in their car, because this is all data that they're sending to the state, or they're paying Mecklenburg County on their taxes for their car. We're receiving that information. So the multipliers are not just made up numbers. It's based off of the types of jobs, the types of company as well. We also have the total expense. So if you add in the new investment, which is the new building or the renovation, the new jobs, and we have this in gray because this is a multiplier. We don't know how much Clay is going to spend on his night on the town for sure, but we have a profile on Clay that he may spend X amount of dollars towards his fun time out, right? So we're not in his pockets, but we kind of know based off of him and his friends what they like to spend on the weekend. That's a multiplier. And then we have the total expense, which is your red line. Your total expense is your county expense of how much does it cost that if we bring in Clay and his friends to work at this facility to make my chips, we know that we're going to have to provide schools, we're going to have hospitals, and if they're rowdy on the weekend, we may need a few more police officers. We know based off of the workers, how many people we bring in, we have to provide a certain level of service as a service provider of the county. That's a minus in the total investment in addition to the grant expense. So the actual BIP check itself is also deducted from the total evaluation here, and it totals out to revenue and expense. So that green line is basically the net of the investment that they make, the predictive analysis of how much they're going to spend, and all of the other multipliers. Now, when we talk about what's an input-output model, there's really three widely utilized models for economic impact analysis. You have RIMS-2, which is Regional Input-Output Modeling Systems. You have M-Plan, which is also very popular as well. It's actually headquarters in Huntersville. It means Impact Analysis for Planning. And then you have REMI, which you've heard time and time again us talk about, Regional Economic Modeling, Inc. Each model uses like foundational data from the U.S. Department of Commerce input-output tables. So the U.S. Department of Commerce tracks all of the data, predicts the trends, and all of the models basically use the same data set as a foundation. So I just wanted to put that out there as well. So we're getting verifiable data into the models from trusted government sources. And then also too, when you look at the kind of the differences between all of them, I'm keeping this very high level here. The simplest model is RIMS, and then the most complex is REMI. And REMI layers input-output models and other modeling techniques. So when you talk about complexity, REMI is the most complex tool out there. So as a part of this presentation, I did a peer review to two people who I know who do economic impact modeling that I've worked with in different regions, folks who've done economic impact models for me for new markets tax credits. I'm talking about people I've known for 15, 20 years. I've talked to people at the Commerce Department here in North Carolina, also the EDPNC. I actually talked to Chuck as well. A unanimous decision. REMI is the most complicated tool, and it's because it's so complex, Implan has kind of carved out a lane for themselves to say, okay, let's kind of scale this back because you need a Brandon to basically run the model and to understand it. But with some training and just some understanding, Brandon has been an excellent technical resource that every time we present a project to him to bring to you, we can verify the data, we can explain it in a way we understand it because we have that resource here. If you would ask me to run the model on my own, might have some challenges for you, but we have the best of the best sitting right here in the room. Now, what are some of the other communities that are utilizing REMI? Well, it's not just us in Mecklenburg County in the silo, but just wanted to provide to you just a few case studies. You have the state of North Carolina actually looked at REMI for Medicaid expansion analysis. Up in the Northeast, the impact of establishing Amazon HQ on the West Coast, you're looking at the economic impact of fire damage from a business perspective. You're looking at energy plans. You're looking at a highway expansion in Louisiana. Kansas City is also looking at various incentive studies. So we're not alone. So when you think about a best-in-class model, a lot of municipalities are not just using REMI for some of the BIPs and small things. It has the capabilities to really understand the magnitude of very large things as well. So the advantages of REMI, I won't read this out in full detail, but it's dynamic, it's complex. And then there's a certain aspect of time that REMI model has that we use to our advantage. So when we bring before you, you see those red, yellow, and blue charts, and there's a whole bunch of years, and you're trying to figure out if the green line is over the red line. Well, REMI has a very unique IP or intellectual property about it that can forecast information over the span of multiple years. Some of the other models have limitations on its outlook and larger impact on the community from a geography standpoint. So REMI also takes into account, especially the one that Brandon utilizes, not just the project and its site, not just the town or the city that it's in, not just the county, and there's imaginary boundaries that we don't understand. But since Mecklenburg County is kind of the hub and this spoke in larger geography, it also accounts for some of the regional data that may impact us. We all understand that Mecklenburg County is a great place to live, work, and recreate. Learn and recreate. I almost got the tagline right. So we have people coming in from Cabarrus County. We have people coming in from Gaston County to go to the Whitewater Center. We have people from South Carolina coming to your hometown in the New Ballantyne Bowl. So when we look at data and its impact on the TIG, such as the Ballantyne Reimagine project, we're just not looking at Mecklenburg County because we understand that's a regional draw. People are coming in from across the border to spend their South Carolina dollars in District 6 at the Ballantyne Bowl, and they're going to North Italia and then Hawkers in the wintertime, which I'll be at as well. So the one thing about REMI is it takes into account one of the larger geography. The consensus on the limitations of REMI, people say it's more expensive than other models, and it's complex. That's probably the biggest limitation. And when we talk about cost, we've been kind of grandfathered in. I won't get too much into the cost, but I can tell you, I was sharing with Brandon, I've done economic impact models with various organizations that I've been a part of. For very simple projects like a BIP, I've been charging anywhere between $5,000 to $8,000 per project. So you can imagine how many projects we've brought before you. Multiply $5,000 to $8,000 per project, and we've getting way more than our money's worth. Some of the older pricing could have been anywhere between $15,000 to $17,000 a year for REMI. And if you weigh that against how much it costs to do an individual project and then its capabilities, in addition to Brandon also utilizes the REMI model for other countywide forecasting in regards to housing and other policy. He's taking those data sets, those multipliers, that information from those various sources, and also comparing that to our projects. So we're not just looking at a BIP in a silo. We're also looking at the impacts that we have on a grant on the larger community, and how does that impact housing, and how does that impact other aspects of our community. So we utilize this tool holistically, not just for a deal by deal cases. Now, this is the takeaway. I'm gonna go ahead and bookend this. The REMI model was selected for its complexity and its ability to understand multifaceted county and regional changes, which I just mentioned. Economic impact models are not AI robots. They're not something that we kind of say, hey, figure this out, and then the robot, good project, and it spits out a sheet of paper. That's not the way it works, right? We do source data from various, we do have data input from various places that I showed you before, but I think of this is more like a digital farmer's almanac. So when, the farmer's almanac was given before to understand the trends and past data per season, so that farmers know when to plant crops, when to harvest. Does it give you the exact day when it's going to rain? Some brides have used the farmer's almanac to kind of predict their wedding date. It works. Some of it didn't work. But we don't look at the farmer's almanac as Nostradamus's Bible to predict the future. We look at the almanac to really understand trends, to make informed decisions that have to be reconciled, that have to be verified, and that have to be understood and then monitored. So look at an impact model very similar to a farmer's almanac, with a little bit more of a twist and a little bit more advancement than that. Staff's professional experience and due diligence and expertise is what really validates a project. We can run REMI models all day long, but the staff that we have in the room, the resources that we use between Dr. Johnson and everyone in the manager's office, that's what really validates a project. So really, when we run a REMI model and we understand its impacts, it's usually confirmation. A lot of the professional due diligence that we have internally, we're verifying this along the way. And the REMI model is kind of a good bill of health. So if you've been exercising, you haven't been eating the chips like Shah, and you go to the doctor's office, you should know whether or not you're going to have a good physical. If you've been eating these corn chips like me, and you go to the doctor's office, you're going to have some bad numbers. So before we come to the doctor's office, AKA the REMI model, we've verified and we've known that we've basically checked all of the boxes on what really validates a project. An economic modeling tool is a valuable data analytic for understanding the broader impact of economic development projects. So when we talk about REMI and it's kind of a comparison to other tools, we really use REMI to understand the broader context. And I think that was part of one of the main reasons why I was selected from the previous boards before, is that we just don't want to look at something deal by deal, but how does this have an impact on the people at large? How does it have an impact on people at District 6 and 5? And how do we understand traffic demands, and what's the impact is going to be on the school systems? That's why REMI was selected. And then last but not least, jobs and new taxable investment are the primary verifiable measures of economic impact. We can talk about how much dollars people we think they're going to spend or where they're going to go, but when we bring a project to you, the new taxable investment is 100% verifiable. So if we say this project is going to build a $200 million facility, that isn't REMI predicting. That's us verifying we have receipts. If we understand the job impacts and we're telling you, hey, this company is going to bring 500 jobs, that's not REMI telling us. That's us verifying, and we're people counting. So a company does not receive an incentive unless they make the investment, which is verified by the tax assessor's office. They pay for their taxes, which is verified by the tax collection office. And they've actually hired the people, which is verified by payroll, and then also North Carolina unemployment insurance data, NC 101. So that's the presentation. I just wanted to see if you had any further questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, let us begin with questions. Do you want to go first, Commissioner Altman?
I appreciate the deep dive. It definitely inspires confidence and something that we rely upon for multi-million-dollar decisions. I think in the mind of the public, the whole TIG BIP thing is a little suspect. And so REMI is important because it helps us to validate to them that they're getting a return on their investment that is definitely net positive and then some. Some of the most high profile BIP or TIGs, and I use it loosely and I shouldn't, but please forgive me, are actually not county ones. They're city ones. Like, what's the one that just happened?
The Pearl.
Sorry,
The Pearl.
not the Pearl, the cities, the stadium.
I was gonna say Pepper.
Was that a BIP or TIG? Do you know?
It was neither.
It was neither. It was neither. Okay. Because, you know, in the, and, you know, I'm not going to ask y'all to sort of defend or explain what another governmental body is doing. But, you know, there was a lot of discussions about how the taxpayer is going to be net positive with that deal. And, you know, and I find myself telling residents, no, really, when we say it, it's true, you know? And so I guess I'm sort of interested in what does the city use? And if it's different than what we use, why do you think ours is a more valid one? Because again, this is about explaining it to residents who aren't clearly delineating between us and the city and some of these different ways to incentivize business. And so if you can comment on that, that would be helpful for me.
I'll give a very brief comment. I can't speak for the city,
Definitely
but
not.
I do know that their staff go through a level of due diligence to evaluate each project. And then some of their multipliers are fundamentally different from ours. We don't have control over a CRVA. So we don't count heads and beds when it comes to hotel. We don't collect certain sales tax. We don't control the airport. That's a city function. So when people are flying in, that's another impact where they park. So what they administer over as a government is fundamentally different. I'm sure if we had an airport, a separate Mecklenburg County airport, and we ran Mecklenburg County water, and we had, just control over the streets, and we had other assets that the city has, I think some of our economic impacts may look different. So we can't, it's not really apples to oranges, but maybe apples to pears, a little bit similar crunch, depending on how you buy the firmness of the pear. But I can't speak on that, but I just wanted to share that some of their economic multipliers are fundamentally different than we have as a county, and how we take care of certain services as a service provider for everyone is totally different too. And then Dr. Johnson may want to elaborate as well.
You're spot on. One of the things that I was thinking was that their revenue source that they're using to make the deal in some instances are different. So in that instance, they could leverage possibly tourism dollars, which is the heads and beds. And then from the tourism dollars, be able to factor what is that return, sales, hotels, and all those other things which aren't what we factor in ours. When he had the little graph that had the table on the left-hand side, and then the graph, we talked about county expenses. So county expenses is different than city expenses because of the types of worlds that we oversee. And because of that, the county also, we have to factor schools, because if you get too much growth and you need new schools, because we're the funder of those capital projects, or we're the funders of the other types of capital amenities that are for all, libraries, parks, and the like. So we have to account for those things as we're doing our model, which they don't have to necessarily take into account because they're not making those types of expenditures.
Well, with BMOC, for example, I guess I'm not clear in retrospect. Like, you hear, I think I've heard county folks say that the data and the science doesn't bear out that sports facilities are good return on investment for communities. Yet BMOC was different for some reason. And I'm not clear why. And I'm also not clear, why do we sometimes do BIPs and sometimes do TIGs?
So I'll give you the BIP TIG, and I don't just kind of, so in concept, we're going to call them the same in concept, because it's based on tax. It's based on the tax value today versus the tax value in the future, and bridging that partnership agreement on the delta. So that's what that's about. The business incentive grants are when we bring in new businesses and new jobs. It's solely about that. The tax increment grant is more lean towards when it is more of the building and the infrastructure. So the tax increment grant supports public infrastructure. So for the example of the atrium, it included roads, it included parking deck, it included other things. So that's what we're supporting. In contrast, and the other thing that I would say about the business incentive grant, and I think we've shared this with you before, in many instances, they're state driven. So in many instances, that total package for that incentive is inclusive of state dollars. And so in those instances, if the state is interested in making that incentive for a job or a business to come to our community or remain in our community, then they're wanting local support as well. So then we then have to verify and confirm it to be able to say, yes, we are willing to, because the state won't make the investment independent of local support. So that's why they're different.
Okay. Can you tell me, BMOC? My
Oh, yeah.
question.
I would say, just from my experience in doing planning and economic development for quite some time, historically, athletic facilities have been poor decisions for certain communities. Today, not so much. And when you hear about Charlotte and our region doing kind of entertainment districts, we just don't use that stadium for football. If we did, it'd probably be bad. But we have a soccer team, you have concerts, you have other events that are being utilized by sports facilities that's fundamentally different from how they were utilized in years past. So that's why you see a lot of cities actually building new facilities where there's Taylor Swift concerts and Beyonce concerts at basketball stadiums, at football stadiums, because they're economic drivers outside of the regular playing days. So when you look at a BMOC Capital, there were opportunities for other events to be held there because of the facilities themselves. So that's a totally different revenue model that's been historically done in cities in regards to stadiums. I grew up in DC. RFK Stadium is still empty because it was a single purpose use. It was just for the Redskins, maybe, or the Washington Commanders. It was historically the Redskins. It was for the Redskins historically, and you rarely had a secondary event there. Now with stadiums, you have concerts, you have conferences, you have all types of sports utilizing the same facility, and you're getting multiple days and multiple uses. We've even seen cases where there's an event there in the morning and something totally separate at night. So what's done now and how companies are utilizing their athletic facilities, totally different revenue model from what has historically been understood as a poor investment for cities.
Thank you. Well, I voted for BMOC because it seemed as if it was going to be programmed 50 out of 52 weeks a year, and had all these different diverse revenue streams and forms of entertainment. But I was trying to square that with what I had heard and was in the literature or whatever. Anyway, thank you for your answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Just one was the whole Tepper thing. That was just cash, right? From tourism taxes.
I don't know.
I think they just wrote him a check, right? Or are going to.
I can't speak on that one.
Can't
I honestly don't know.
You really don't know? Okay.
The true revenue source, but if it's so, it may have, again, their tourism dollars, they're able to cycle it differently then.
Right. I really don't have any questions. That was a really good discussion right there. I loved your chips and your analogy and all that. So good teacher trait there.
You have to make it understandable for a fifth grader.
That's right.
Okay, my question is, I get how all of the inputs you can, that feels verifiable and stuff like that. Do we ever go back and true it up and say, well, we thought this was going to be this, but it really turned out to be even greater, or it didn't really pan out the way we thought? Like, I know that there are certain things like number of employees and the investment total and those things that we do definitely verify. But what about those extra induced things that we predict?
not in the full detail that we predict. And I'll just be really concise because we have a closed session. But as a part of this review, along with Brandon, one of the forecasts that he worked on was for COVID and understanding the impacts on business. And when that study was originally put out, some of our peer cities thought that we were going to go back to 2007-8 recession numbers in regards to economic impact. Brandon ran a different model that took regional data, other inputs and outputs, and understood that there was going to be a decline, but there was going to be a slow progression back to a new normal, when other cities just thought the worst of the worst. And when we went back and looked at the data, qualitatively, we were more accurate on the REMI model's assessment as opposed to the doom and gloom going back to 2007, 2008 data. So that's just one very high level example, but as far as the data for BIPs and TIGs, jobs and new taxable investment is what we stick by. And because our revenue stream, how sales tax goes to the state and then comes back, we don't capture the full amount. And then it's evenly dispersed amongst counties. It will require probably 2 more Brandons to reconcile everything that Brandon input outputs. But that's kind of the simple
And I would,
answer.
and I would say the other thing just to take in consideration is when we're bringing project by project, it has all these other, we could go back and say, oh, how was the trend? Did we see changes?
Mhm.
But we can't control it for that new business. The data set would be for everything else that has happened in our market or our ecosystem simultaneously with that one.
We can't
We
isolate.
can't isolate it.
Yeah.
There has been success though on some other users of REMI, like the BMW facility that was built down in South Carolina. That happened in Dorchester County. They're teeny tiny compared to us. And they ran a REMI model there. And, it showed about the immediate need for building 3 more schools and such like that.
Mhm.
They were easily able to take that data and show that it worked there. It's just, we're so big. A lot of these things are,
Right.
we're dropping a bucket.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I guess we need to move on and get a motion to go into closed session.
So moved.
Second.
All right. All those in favor? Aye. Okay. So ready to go into closed session.
Thank you.
Brandon, thank you so much for your expertise. It really is appreciated.
That was really, I enjoyed it. I told you, I said, that was geeking out right there. We heard a lot of information on a level that we don't usually get to hear it. And it was, I understood it. I was shocked that I understood it all.
Move to adjourn. All right.
to adjourn. Second.
All right. All those in favor of adjourning? Aye. All right. That is unanimous. We are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So we don't have to be anywhere till 6 p.m., right?
Well, dinner is down there.
Bye, Megan. Thank you.
Get a big old name up there on the screen.
The district.